So I would like to greet everyone who decided to join our webinar. Today we'll be speaking about DDoS attacks with true experts from CloudFlare. Trey Green will be our presenter today, but before we start, I would like to ask our guests to send a plus symbol into the chat window if you can hear me well. So to the left, at the very bottom of the screen, there is a chat. You can also use it to post your questions here. And after the presentation is over, we will be happy to answer your questions. So Peter, Martin, Jatin, thank you so much. Now, I guess it's time to start. Trey, please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Trey Gwynn. I am a solution engineer at CloudFlare. CloudFlare is a web performance and security service. We attempt to supercharge your website. I work as a solution engineer, and as a solution engineer, I work with our largest customers to help them adopt the Cloudflare service. One of the areas that Cloudflare helps a great deal with is DDoS. And today I'm going to cover a DDoS 101, and specifically what folks with e-commerce stores should know about DDoS, and to try to do an introduction. So as Kinsia mentioned, please feel free to post your questions in the chat, and we should address them either in line or at the end of the presentation. Today, I will be covering what is DDoS, what is this thing DDoS that makes all the news, and do a quick primer on how the web works. DNS, the domain name system, and HTTP, that thing you see in your web browser bar when you type in a web address. Also, what are the different types of DDoS? And this is a key feature I'd like to take away from this presentation, is that DDoS is not just one thing. It's a very large bucket, and it's important to understand the different varieties of DDoS so that you know that you're protecting yourselves from those. Then I'm going to describe how Cloudflare stops DDoS, and as a e-commerce store owner, what you should do to protect your e-commerce store. So first off, what is DDoS? DDoS stands for Distributed Denial of Service. This fundamentally is an attack coming from lots of location with the intent of overwhelming the resources of your application or your server, so that legitimate customers can no longer be served. And there's many different ways of doing this, but in general, you're trying to overwhelm the resources of the server so that you can no longer serve legitimate customers. So to put this in a more understandable context, I'd like to think of how would you DDoS a pizza store? If you had a pizza shop and you had 5 delivery guys that were on their scooters out delivering pizza, how would you DDoS that business? You could have lots of fake orders coming in. Those fake orders are sending your delivery guys all over town, going through all of the pepperoni for your pepperoni pizza. And then, when a legitimate customer calls in and says, I would like to get some pizza, you'll have to tell them, oh, it'll be 2 hours before we can get you a pizza, and they cancel their order, and you're not able to serve legitimate customers. And this is fundamentally what a DDoS is on the web as well, where resources so that legitimate users are not being served. So DDoS on the web, we can imagine how this works in the pizza shop, but how does this actually work on the web? This is what it looks like. An attacker will send lots of requests or lots of traffic towards your website, and your poor visitor over here to the right is just getting shunted off to the side, and their traffic is not being dealt with well. So the important thing to understand how does DDoS work is to understand how the web works in the first place. And there's sort of 3 key principles, and you can think of someone going to your website and making a request as being something similar to a phone call. The first thing that happens is a DNS lookup. This is the domain name system, and it's essentially like a lookup of a phone number. If you're going to call someone, the first thing you do is look up their phone number on in the phone book. The second thing you do if you're looking up someone to make a call is you would dial their number and you'd hear the ring, and there is a sort of routing that is happening on the phone system. This happens with TCP IP on the internet. So with DNS, the domain name system, you look up an IP address, and then with TCP IP, there's a connection from your computer to the other computer. This is essentially the same thing as dialing. And then the third thing that happens is an HTTP request. And this is actually what your web browser does. And you've seen in your address bar of your web browser, even the one we're looking now with the webinar in it, you see an HTTPS. Sometimes you see an HTTP://. This is essentially the language that is being spoken on that phone call on the internet. So when you think about DDoS, an interesting thing to think about is that you can actually DDoS any of these areas. And so we'll go into those one at a time. So the other thing to consider with DDoS, and we're trying to understand the different varieties, is that there's volumetric DDoS and there's sort of application DDoS. So volumetric DDoSes, volumetric DDoSes are the ones you always hear about in the news. They have big numbers. They're very exciting. The interesting thing is these are like a caveman with a club. They're big, dumb, and powerful, but they're really not very intelligent. And all an attacker is doing is flooding your website with traffic, overwhelming your internet connection, overwhelming your routers and firewalls with this just flood of traffic so that your infrastructure cannot handle any legitimate requests. The other kind of DDoS is an application or protocol attack. These are attacks that are tuned to specific weaknesses. And when in the previous slide, when we talked about the phone call on the internet, the lookup of the IP address, sort of like looking up the phone number, the dialing of the phone number, the TCP IP connection, and then what you're saying over the phone, the HTTP request. Normally an application or protocol attack is going to go after one of those three layers. So let's dive into volumetric attacks. So what happens when someone sends a flood of traffic to your website? This is what your website looks like. This is what a website of a customer who came onto Cloudflare. Before they came to Cloudflare, this is what their website looked like, and this is what the traffic looked like that was coming towards their website. If you look on the left side, you'll see that this is in gigabits per second, and this attack peaked out at over 300 gigabits per second. And this website, their normal traffic, the line, the blue bar, is indistinguishable from zero because normal traffic was 1 to 2 gigabits per second. As you can imagine, these huge floods of traffic meant that their website was completely incapable of keeping up. And this is a volumetric attack, or just a giant fire hose of traffic. And so I see a question has popped up, Jayton. I'm going to, and it's asking about XCart v4, so we'll address that towards the end of the conversation when we talk about XCart specifically. So so how does someone create this flood of traffic? The answer to, how do you create, something like 500 gigabits of traffic? The answer to that is you ask little questions that have big answers. This is along the same lines where if you can imagine I wanted to overwhelm my friend Steve, I could send out a questionnaire to 50 people and say, please tell me your life story. And then I'll say that my name is Steve. Go ahead and please send me your life story. So then my friend Steve receives all this text, all this information. He's having to hunt through all these life stories to understand, to read through those before he can get to his real mail and understand, what his legitimate customers are doing. He's just getting this flood of life stories and he doesn't know where they're coming from. Along the same lines, you can do little questions with big answers with DNS. So this little question, dig for any DNS record for the ietf.org, this is a DNS lookup, has a big answer. So you can see little question, big answer. And the reason why you do the a small question with a big answer is you want amplification. This allows that big flood of traffic that kills a website. And your not only is the victim does not have the bandwidth to absorb these big attacks, but an attacker really doesn't have the bandwidth to launch them themselves. So they're trying to send out. They'll use all of their bandwidth in order to send out little questions, and then the answers are, some percent, some larger than the question. So uh, with with amplification, we see amplification happens on 3 different protocols in particular. DNS, the one we just saw an example of, that gives you around a 50x amplification factor. So the answer will oftentimes be 50 times bigger than the question. NTP is Network Time Protocol. This is how you look up time on the internet. The answer is going to be 200 times bigger than the question. So much bigger amplification. And SNMP, the Simple Network Management Protocol, this is part of the plumbing of the internet, but a very old protocol. It can actually offer a 650x amplification factor. So if the attacker can send out, 1 gigabyte of questions, then if SNMP, the answers will be 650 gigabytes in size. And then, of course, when you ask this question, you ask as if you're the intended victim, so that your victim is getting all of the answers and getting flooded with this attack. And you can see how this works. You can imagine an attacker on a laptop with a minimum internet connection goes and controls, let's say, 10 servers, 10 compromised servers. Each of those compromised servers can each produce 1 gigabit of questions. Let's say we have an amplification factor of 50. And from those 10 gigs of questions and an amplification factor of 50, the answers are now 500 gigabits, which is now being aimed at your intended victim. So you can see, while very effective and hard to deal with, also very easy to launch. Unfortunately, too easy to launch. So we see these attacks at Cloudflare on a daily basis. So that was volumetric attack. We also want to understand that DDoS is, there's more to attack than attacks. So these are attacks that go after those different layers in that internet phone call. The DNS lookup, the TCP connection, which is sort of like dialing the phone, and the HTTP request, which is essentially what's being spoken on the phone. The sort of web phone call, as you will. So first thing that we see is DNS Infrastructure Attack. This is just looking up the phone number. You have a service. Every website on the internet has to have a DNS service. So when someone wants to get to your website, they have to look up your IP address. A more modern attack that we're seeing is many lookups being sent at the exact same time, trying to overwhelm your sort of phone book service, your DNS service. When the DNS service is overwhelmed, then no legitimate customers can find your phone number, and then they can't make a phone call in the first place. And so if they can't do legitimate customers can't do a DNS lookup, then they will never be able to connect to your site. Cloudflare is seeing attacks here of over 300 million packets per second. So these, very large, and these are launched by botnets that are distributed around the world. The next step up after that phone book lookup is you can have TCP/IP protocol attacks. Many people will have heard of a thing called a SYN flood. Without going into too much detail, this is essentially like a crank calling on the internet. It's if you imagine that you are a brick and mortar store and you've got a bank of phones, this is, hundreds of phone calls coming in, or in this case, millions of phone calls on the internet coming in at one time. And when you answer the phone, no one's on the other end. And you're spending all this time with the phone ringing and nobody on the other end. And you're spending so much time doing that you can't deal with legitimate customers. So it's important that you're protecting against these sort of what we call layer 3 and layer 4 attacks on the, if you are familiar with the OSI model, but these TCP/IP attacks. And then the last thing at that higher level is an application attack. So this is the language being spoken on the phone, on the phone call on the web. This is what's happening over HTTP once someone actually has a website up and running. And if we look here, we see an application attack. We think, okay, here's my website. I want someone to buy my business plan or to sign up and create an account. These are areas we want a lot of clicks on, right? I mean, as business owners, this is where our bread and butter comes from. Well, the challenge happens is what happens when you have 2 million clicks of of fake orders on your application in under 2 minutes. One, can your servers actually handle processing that load? That's a really significant challenge just to deal with 2 million orders in a short period of time. And then secondly, who's going to now clean out all of these fake orders? Who's going to clean up the system after all these fake orders have come through? And then what happened to your legitimate users during this attack? It's important to know that, especially as an e-commerce platform, time is money. So anytime your website is knocked offline or is too busy with uh, illegitimate or sort of attack traffic, legitimate users are not being served. Those orders are not being processed, and then your brand is being affected in a negative way. Last thing I will show here on the attack side is the evolution we've seen of DDoS attacks. Here at Cloudflare, we stop arguably some of the largest and stop more DDoS attacks than most people or most providers on the internet. And we've seen that back in 2013, people were doing these DNS volumetric attacks. And then as we went up to 2014, and we're talking about volumetric and application attacks, now we're seeing, we saw NTP, the network time protocol amplification attacks. And so they were getting much bigger, sort of 400 gig, 500 gig attacks. And then we saw that the attacks got smaller, but were aimed at specific layers, so these tuned application attacks. So we saw DNS infrastructure attacks and HTTP attacks. So this is the phone book lookup attacks, and this is someone going and clicking the order button 2 million times in 2 minutes. And so we see this trend. While these still exist and are easy to stop, it's important as an e-commerce site owner that you are able to deal with both types of attacks. So now that I've scared you with a world of scary DDoS, what can you do about that? Cloudflare offers a service that helps to address this. And the way we address this is Cloudflare, without Cloudflare, visitors, crawlers, bots, this could include good crawlers like Google and Baidu, and then also attackers. They're all connecting directly to sort of a naked website that's unprotected. So it's very hard for that website to manage all of this traffic in one go. With Cloudflare, both visitors, crawlers, bots, and attackers, all of these connect to Cloudflare first. Cloudflare can evaluate if the request is successful or it's legitimate. And if it is legitimate, then we pass the request through to an origin server. If it's not, we can block attackers. If there are crawlers and bots that need to go fast, then we can make them go fast. And if they need to go slow, we can make them go slow. But we can make intelligent decisions to manage the load that is hitting your website. And how does Cloudflare do this? And particularly, how does Cloudflare handle these like 500 gig attacks? The way we do this is we have a very large global network with significant capacity, and this is a network that is growing rapidly as well. On this network, we do something really special that is it's a technology called Anycast. So once your website is on Cloudflare, then when someone does that DNS lookup, that IP, sort of like the internet's phone book, they look up the IP address of your website, they will get back a Cloudflare IP address. And traditionally on the internet, you had a concept of unicast. And so when someone looked up your website IP address, no matter where they were in the world, let's say your website was in Amsterdam, was hosted at Amsterdam, then everyone, when they connected your website, would connect to Amsterdam. And that IP address for your website that was in Amsterdam, if anyone tried to connect to that IP address was always in Amsterdam. So with Anycast, we do something different. So once a website's on Cloudflare, and when they do a DNS lookup, they find a Cloudflare IP address for your website, those Cloudflare IPs are advertised from all of the data centers on our network map at the same time. That means that whether you are a legitimate user or an attacker, if you're coming from Australia, the website IP is in Australia. If you're coming from Western Europe, then that website IP could be served out of Amsterdam or Frankfurt or London. If you're coming from Hong Kong, that IP address is in Hong Kong. If you're coming from Dallas, Texas, then that IP address is in Dallas, Texas, the United States. And the benefit of this is, one, it is very fast, so users are always routed to something that's very close to them and automatically. And two, a really big benefit of this is that if there's an attack happening against your site, it's getting automatically load balanced or diluted across all of our data centers. So this is how we're able to absorb very large attacks. This allows us to sort of aggregate our capacity. So even with a 500 gigabit per second attack across 36 data centers, then once you have 36 data centers, you're only dealing with 14 gigs per location. While that's still a large amount of traffic, it's very manageable for a provider like Cloudflare. So this is how Cloudflare absorbs large attacks. And even when we talk about the complex attacks in HTTP, they're sort of processor intensive. This is how we're able to also distribute that filtering. And that is a very good question, Sanju. You've asked, how does Cloudflare slow down the process compared to a naked website? And if so, how much? That was a question asked by our founders when they designed the Cloudflare service. They said, we want to build this great security service, but we know that website owners will not be willing to deal with performance degradation. And so they said, we need to try to minimize that performance degradation and introduce a lot of other services. And as it turns out, once a website is on Cloudflare, it is faster than without Cloudflare. So there is no performance degradation over a naked website. On average, a website gets 2 times faster on Cloudflare, and 2/3 of the load that would normally go to the website is handled by Cloudflare directly. We're addressing today the sort of security side of Cloudflare, but Cloudflare also offers performance features as part of their service. So a website is both more secure and faster. So you are an e-commerce website owner, and you want to address from a security perspective to make sure that these are the DDoS attack vectors that you need to address. So number one, you want to make sure that your DNS is protected from DDoS. Cloudflare offers we are the world's largest managed DNS provider, and as well as being the fastest, and we protect our DNS from DDoS. So whichever DNS service you use, you need to make sure it is protected from DDoS. Two, you need to protect your website from volumetric attack. So you need to have some service or some capability for absorbing very large floods of traffic. So floods of traffic in the last few months have been 500 gigs, but these just continue to go up. So a provider like Cloudflare, we have about 4.5 terabits of capacity to absorb attacks, and that's a number that only continues to grow. You would want to make sure that your DDoS mitigation provider can absorb very large attacks. Third, you want to make sure that you're protecting your application. So the requests that are happening over HTTP, we want to make sure that those are being filtered effectively. And a really important thing to use here is a WAF. This stands for Web Application Firewall. And this is something that's going to scan for malicious requests in HTTP. And above all of these things, not only do you have to do all this protection, but at the same time you need to go fast, because we all know that performance is key to conversion and selling more product on an e-commerce platform. So it's important that you do all of these things. And so, as I mentioned just a few minutes ago on the last slide, CloudFlare is going to provide actually all of these capabilities, as well as making your site faster. And whether you go with Cloudflare or a different provider, we definitely recommend all e-commerce platforms to be making sure that they're both protecting themselves from all the different DDoS vectors and making sure that they are fast, and hopefully fast all around the world, to address a global market. So if you'd like to get in contact, we have an alliance with Xcart, and you can email that alliance at alliance@xcart.com. And if you're interested in evaluating Cloudflare, please go look at our plans at cloudflare.com/plans. And that's my presentation. I want to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time. I hope it was helpful. Do we have anything we want to address today? I'm going to maybe...
Trey, thank you. Thank you for your presentation. Actually, we have one question which was not answered. It was from Jatin. Well, actually, it was answered, because speaking about volumetric attacks, he said that it is actually protected not on the software, not on the application level, but rather on the server level. So, Jatin, no, there is no such a configuration, unfortunately. Sorry about that.
Yes, and so yeah, the question from Jatin about Xcart 4, does Xcart 4 have any admin configuration to limit the max number of requests on a site in a given time, or would that need to be handled in some other way? And your answer was that there's not an option to limit the max. The other thing I would mention, coming from Cloudflare, is it's important not to put a hard limit on the number of requests a site can handle, because all an attacker needs to do is use up that max number of requests, and then no legitimate users can get through at that point. So it's important that if you're using a mitigation service, a security service, that it can intelligently identify if the request is a valid request or an illegitimate request. That way, all the attack requests are being filtered out, and if you only can handle 100 legitimate requests per second, that those are going to only legitimate users and not to attackers. I think that's the last of our questions, and thank you all for your response and the positive feedback so far. We look forward to continuing to work with Xcart.
Well, I just would like to thank everyone for joining our webinar. Thank you so much for your time. Thank you, Trey, for your excellent presentation. If you have any questions after the webinar, please do send them to alliance@x-cart.com, and I will forward them to Trey and his team. And meanwhile, thank you and have a great day, guys. Goodbye.
Goodbye. Thank you all.